Yeah, that's the threat. And in a second, I think it's on one of the dot points coming up. The challenge is that if you have an unstable state, people won't invest in the state. And tourism is a form of investment. So yes, Australians won't travel there. Egypt is facing this right now. 90% of their economy was based on tourism. Egypt's in some civil strife right now. They're literally executing journalists. And no one's traveling there. There is no economy. It's totally stopped. They don't produce anything. They don't export anything. They're entirely dependent on foreigners like us visiting the pyramids. So the country's, it's collapsed entirely. So yes, in this case, Kate's right. We want to think of Indonesia as a safe place to travel to places like Bali and all the amazing islands. They've got incredible surf beaches. But if we think it's unsafe, we're not going to go. So that's the context. Bombs going off at Western Bali, both of the nightclubs where Westerners went, particularly Australians. Marriott Hotel, a Western Hotel, Australian embassy. Why is it important? It's important because of the threat of JI. So Indonesia needs to combat the threat. This was a quote, and we looked at this from one of the JI. Our war will continue until the liberation of the land of Muslims. Like, some of these radical terrorists don't like Westerners. They don't like the idea of us drinking in nightclubs or surfing on their beaches or buying stuff from their markets. It's a threat to their idea of what Islam is and being a Muslim. So this is a challenge to Indonesia. Indonesia needs to maintain security. And it comes back to sovereignty. If you can't maintain control over your state, you no longer have sovereignty. Someone else is running your state. You might be the president, but someone else is calling the shots. And the last one is the one that Kate alluded to, a safe place for investment. And every time you travel somewhere, you're investing in the local economy. When you buy clothes, when you go shopping, when you eat food, when you pay for hotels, that's a form of investment. So why is an anti-terrorism policy important? It's important to combat the threat, maintain security, there are economic issues. What do they do? We already know this. They established Detachment 88. They work with the US, Australia, and very simple. So they didn't have this group before the Bali bombings. It didn't exist. And then they went, okay, we've got a serious problem with terrorists. We need to form this group. We need to get training from the best in the world. The Americans, we've got this group that can combat terrorism. And they're good. They're brutal at times. They probably kill more people than they need to. They're more violent than they need to be. But is there a better way to combat terrorism than the hardest one? Detachment 88. Easy to remember the name because 88, that's the number of Australian victims in Bali bombings. It is a coincidence. It's become this thing that's now, people think that's the reason why they were called that, but that wasn't the reason why they were called that. It's a really funny story about how the minister misheard the words 8 and 8 in some other thing and thought it meant something else. And it's hard to explain, but yeah, the pronunciation of 8 and 8 in Indonesian sounds like something else that sounded good. So the minister who was naming them went for 88. And it's since become a coincidence. And everyone's like, well, that's a terrible story. Let's just go with this. It is a coincidence, but you can remember it that way. That's the response. Effective? No, it's been effective. 700 suspects captured, 500 prosecuted. JI has shrunk off the map. We haven't had any attacks in a while. The leader's in prison. That's the really gentle-looking man you saw earlier in the photo. So it's been effective. It's a little bit cruel, and they're a little bit harsh.
Why?
Because he wasn't tried for the Bali bombings. He was tried for something else kind of related to it. He wasn't tried for murder. He was tried for, like, funding, something like that, yeah. It wasn't a murder charge. So yes, effective. Like always, limited. It's a concern that Detachment 88 goes too far, that they go places and they beat everyone up, they shoot indiscriminately, that they're in fact harsher than they need to be. And so there are human rights abuses happening. So Indonesia uses these guys for lots of reasons. They send them into West Papua. Now, you could probably argue that West Papua isn't necessarily a terrorist issue, it's a secession issue. But Indonesia sends these guys in to belt some heads, to intimidate. There's the question also of Australia being complicit. Also, just go back to the fact that the spying scandal means we're not going to cooperate. So as a result, cooperation between the two states has stopped. So that spying scandal is something you can keep coming back to. Even when I haven't used it, you can use it for all 6 of these national interests. Why is some of the things Indonesia doing not working? Because it requires Australia and Indonesia to work together. Let's listen to Mr. Carr for 60 seconds. This was the Foreign Minister talking about Detachment 88 going too far and being too cruel.
Somebody who is prepared to discuss what's going on is Australia's Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, and he joined me from Perth a short time ago. Senator Carr, our journalists have been told that Australian officials believe Detachment 88 was involved in the killing of Marco Tabuni. Is that correct?
I can't say that, Lee. We've made representations with the Indonesian government for an investigation into his death. We've made representations, I should say, to the Indonesians about human rights in the Papuan provinces of Indonesia. We'll continue to do that. We'll continue to make representations for an inquiry into the circumstances of his death.
Australian officials have raised with the Indonesians on numerous occasions this particular case. That would indicate that you do think there is a problem, doesn't it?
Well, we think the bit...
Yes, because we train them and fund them. So this is why she's asking him the questions, because everyone knows, it's public knowledge, this isn't a conspiracy theory. We fund them. And so, yeah, the spying scandal is threatening that funding, threatening that cooperation. Okay, Mr. Carr, that was useful. It was just in relation to these human rights abuses. That's the hard power response. So hard power is about what? Force, coercion, threats, violence. Not everything is about hard power, though. States can also use soft power. So we have the soft power response. Two states do something which is a pretty incredible program that most people might say they're against on the surface. We give Indonesia $500 million a year to build schools. So instead of spending that money here on schools here, we spend it on schools in Indonesia. And lots of people are against it. And in fact, Mr. Abbott very early on was against it. And then his own cabinet convinced him of why it was a good idea. I'm glad he came around. We build schools which are non-Islamic schools, non-radical schools. And as a result, Indonesian kids can go to schools where they're not going to become radicalized. So no one just turns one day and becomes a terrorist. It's a long stage where you gradually become more radical and more anti-Australian, anti-American, anti-Western. The idea with these schools is that we provide places where young people can become educated, but not educated to hate Western. So for us, this is an investment, and we help Indonesia with this. Article. Page 37. Again, I'll just read the first couple of paragraphs. Or $500 million school deal for Jakarta. Australia will spend $500 million building 2,000 schools in Indonesia. 2,000 schools. In an effort to improve the prospects of Indonesia's youth and moderate the influence of the country's religious schools. I'm going to read that again. Australia will spend $500 million building 2,000 schools in Indonesia to moderate the influence of the country's religious schools. So we're scared that they've got these really strict religious schools that are basically raising kids to be terrorists. We're going to combat that by building other schools which are non-radical. They're normal schools like any other school. Yes. So they're taught from a very young age about all the negative parts of the West. And they're taught that in comparison to the Quran, the Islamic holy book, and all the positive things about that. And over time, when that's perpetuated, day after day, week after week, year after year, anyone will turn to a particular point of view. Yeah. So the non-radical schools will study a less radical version of Islam. They'll still study the Quran, but they won't study the really strict reading of it. And the same thing is done with the Bible. The Old Testament of the Bible has some stuff in it which is horrible. Stuff like you can sell your daughters to slavery. If you plant two fields next to each other, you can stone the farmer. It's got all this stuff which was very old views, but we don't teach those views as being strict. We have to follow them. We teach the message of those views. The radical stuff is quite strict. So that's the soft power response. You can see it's not about threats. It's not about coercion. It's about co-opting. It's about cooperation. But you can see it's going to be dependent on the two working together. Both going to be former leaders pretty soon because Bang Bang Yudhoyono is about to be replaced by soon we're going to have a new president. He's at the end of his second term. You only get 2 terms in Indonesia, like American politics. They're still counting the votes. They don't know. It's tight. They can't believe how tight it is. And if it's within a certain margin, then they have another election, but they reduce the candidates. Instead of 50 candidates, the top 4 most popular ones, they have another. So they're probably going to have. One of them's got a Botok, I think. Botok. Oh, it's a good one. I hope it's him too. Effectiveness. It's difficult to say how effective this is going to be. It's long term. If we're talking about changing the mindsets of kids today, we're not going to know for 10 years or 15 years whether it worked. But we've definitely helped to build 2,000 schools. Or rather, to put it another way, Indonesia has built 2,000 schools in collaboration with Australia. This is about what Indonesia has done. They've worked with us. As always, it's limited by scandal. And these articles in the subject reader are chosen very carefully. This one, page 38. Terror is still a joint issue, Australian Federal Police told by Indonesia. This is from December 2013. Indonesian police have told their Australian counterparts that the spy scandal will not affect their joint cooperation in tracking down terrorists in Indonesia. The news is released for the Abbott government, which feared that Australian-Indonesian cooperation on counter-terrorism, which has directly helped to save lives, may not have the effect it had desired. So, all of these things that are about cooperation, you can bring them back and use the spy thing to talk about how they're limited. It's not going to be as effective as we want it because states don't trust each other. Here, I'm not quite done this on slide. We've got an example of 2 foreign policy instruments being used. So on all the other PowerPoints, we've got one at a time. Here we can see Indonesia is using 2 foreign policy instruments. One is the military power, militarisation, using Detachment 88 to fight terrorism. But they're also using diplomacy, working with Australia for diplomacy, working with Australia to fight terrorism cooperatively. So this is an example of 2 different instruments being used by Indonesia. If we were studying this using Australia as our state, we would say Australia was using aid. We're using money to help achieve our goal of security and fighting terrorism. We're funding development of detachment. But we're not doing Australia, we're doing Indonesia. They've used military power, they've used diplomacy. Two tools. We're not going to do these. These are all, these questions were all about numbers, because the answer to every one of them are numbers answers. We're not going to do it. Instead, can you take out the worksheet which we were given at the start of today's lesson? Just want to make sure everyone understands the worksheet. This is a summary, the worksheet for the previous two national interests. First one, military power as a foreign policy instrument. This has to be about relations with other states. Foreign policy means outside of the state. So no one is going to talk about deploying troops to West Papua. That's inside the state, you can't do it. We're not here Monday, Tuesday. We lose Monday's class. That's why I have to rush through today's. Yeah. So that's A, military power. You're not talking about West Papua. The next question, which is also A, diplomacy. So how have they used diplomacy to achieve either territorial integrity or the immigration one? You're going to be talking about the Bali process. That's your example there. So diplomacy, relations between states, agreements, Bali process. You're making that link. The next question down, Indonesia responding to threats to territorial sovereignty. Here you're talking about the South China Sea and or West Papua. So you might do a 2+2, 2 marks on West Papua, 2 marks on South China Sea. You might do the whole thing just on South China Sea. Not explicitly. You're describing the threat, so you will somehow have to talk about how it is threatening the security of the state, either the water resources in the South China Sea or control of West Papua, or both. So you need to talk about why it is actually a threat. Over the page. Almost done. One issue affecting Indonesia's national interest. So describe the issue of people movement. So what is the issue? How does it affect Indonesia? Again, you can refer to sovereignty. Control of borders, control of territory, regular or irregular movement of people. And the last one introduces two terms, unilateral and multilateral. Explain why states use both unilateral and multilateral action to achieve the national interest. So it's a 6 marker. 3 marks will be on a unilateral response, 3 marks will be on a multilateral. It's really 2 questions. What is one unilateral response? What is one multi? It's an explain, so it has to be why, yes. Why would they use a unilateral for this purpose? Why would they use multilateral for that? So you describe, explain, describe, explain.